Good afternoon. I am Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Thank you for joining us for another in our series of Just Conversations, where we engage issues of racialized inequities intrinsic to our nation and our collective responsibility to create a more just future. This fall, our Just Conversations are focusing on the issues raised by the New York Times essay project known as the 1619 Project. Today, it is a singular honor to have joining me in this Just Conversation, Dr. Lonnie G. Bunch III, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian and the founding director of the African American Museum of History and Culture. Secretary Bunch is the author of many articles and essays and of a book that I highly commend for you all to read, A Fool's Errand. It is a book about creating the museum and much, much more. Thank you, Secretary Bunch, for taking the time to join me in this conversation today.
It's an honor to be with you. Anytime I'm with you, I learn so much. So thank you for letting me learn more again.
Well, I am humbled by that, and it is mutual. Let's get right in. There's so much to talk about. So I want to start with this notion of how we understand history, of the power of of history. It strikes me that in many respects, the African American Museum of History and Culture is doing in a visual way, humanizing, as you put it, history in a way that the 1619 Project was doing through essays. That is, you have all, as you have also said, showing forth the promise of American life and the limits of the promise through an African American historical and cultural lens. I have come to think, as I have said to you earlier, of the museum as critical race theory on the mall. Can you speak to the similarities between debates surrounding critical race theory and the debates that were surrounding the need for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and perhaps what these debates tell us about the power of how we tell our history?
Well, I always felt that the African American Museum was 1619 before the project,
That's right.
critical race theory before critical race theory was popular. That in essence, what I really felt was crucially important was that America has rarely confronted its tortured racial history. It's rarely said, how do I understand who I really am? And that often when people talk about issues of race, it's really ancillary stories that the real story is here, but oh yeah, we need to talk about race. And what I wanted to do with the museum, and what I hope the discussions around 1619 do, is not only say, let us make more visible this history, but rather to suggest that this history is the quintessential American history. That in essence, these are the stories that shape us all. And that in essence, if we do not grapple with these stories, if we do not candidly face these stories, then what we're doing is we're really not knowing who we really are. And I've always been struck by, at the opening of the museum, what President George Bush said. He said that a great country faces its history. And if we're a great country, let us not be afraid of understanding who we once were, helping us better contextualize who we are now, and maybe then finding a better future.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of something that the late Toni Morrison always said, and that is that when you talk about American identity, you're talking about race,
Right.
and you've got to grapple with these issues of race. And even as we do that, grapple with what people have called the sort of difficult or
Right.
hard truth of this country, you've also pointed us towards something else, and that is that in talking about race, it's not simply trying to talk about the past
Right.
and the past that has brought us here, but it's also required if we are going to indeed be better.
That's right.
And you've called the museum in this regard sort of a site of transformation.
Yep. Yep.
What is the role of museums, if you will, in terms of trying to help the nation heal and in the struggle for racial justice?
I've always felt my whole career has been that when a nation is in crisis, its institutions need to step up. And
Mm.
I've always felt that museums had a crucial role. People trust museums. Museums are one of the few places people of different political points of view and sometimes even racial points of view come together. So I've always felt that museums needed to have the courage to be the places that mattered, to talk about difficult issues. I've pushed museums to say, if you don't talk about social justice, then you're not a museum. If you're a place of history and you don't talk about social justice, what you're talking about is nostalgia. And
Hmm.
nostalgia is fun, but it won't fill the belly. It won't inspire the soul. And so for me, what I expect is that museums ought to be a place where people come and grapple with the past, grapple with the present, but maybe more than anything else, if I had my druthers, I'd rather be a place that helped the public embrace ambiguity, right?
Uh,
Because one of the great flaws, I would argue, in America is that we look for simple answers to complex questions.
that's right.
And sometimes museums have contributed to that. My notion is if we can create opportunities for people to embrace ambiguity, to understand nuances, shades of gray, complexity, debate, oh my God, what a contribution we make to this nation. So for me, I challenge museums. If you are cities on the hill that nobody goes to, if you are places that recognize that it's just about yesterday, not about today and tomorrow, then why are you there? But if you're institutions that say, how do I help make a country better? That's what you need to do.
So I agree. But does it not matter whose gaze it is that is indeed directing, curating the museum? I read some time ago, and reading your book this time took me back to it. Some time ago, I read your essay, Flies in the Buttermilk. And I tell you, I read it because I was looking for James Baldwin's essay, Fly in the Buttermilk, right? And and of course, we all love Baldwin,
We
and
do.
your essay came up along with this. So I said, oh, so I read your essay, Flies in the Buttermilk, and I recalled that essay when I read your book, and the dearth of
Yeah.
Black
Mhm.
museum directors and curators of
Mhm.
color.
Mhm.
And one of the powers of what you're doing and who you are as secretary of the Smithsonian is bringing a different gaze, a
Yeah.
gaze of a
Mhm.
people who had
Mhm.
to live and have lived in complexity. And so what difference does it make? If things change much, by the way, is it still the fly in the buttermilk or the button on the blouse, as I like to say?
you
And what
know,
difference
I
does the gaze make?
I would argue that one of the most important things is to have many gazes in cultural institutions. And that for years, I always felt that the gaze of race, the gaze of African American culture was so limited. There were so few people, and even people of goodwill somehow didn't have the same gaze. And so my notion always was that you've got to embrace diversity,
Mm,
not just because it's right,
right.
because it makes you better. It makes you see the sort of whole waterfront, if you will. And what I felt in my whole career is that there were many times that I realized, and I bet you feel the same, that sometimes just by being in the room, you've changed the discourse, right? You don't have to say a thing, you've changed the discourse. And so I think that museums are better, but I would argue that my generation, there were so many people that should have been leading museums, head curators, who didn't get that shot.
That's
So
right.
I was committed to making sure that when I got to build a museum, I would hire a diverse, gifted staff, and I would encourage them to leave because they've drank the Kool-Aid. They understand,
Right.
the way we view things. I want you to go and be like Johnny Appleseed. Plant
Yeah.
those apple trees everywhere. And
Yeah.
so I think that there's still so much work to be done. There's still a chasm, but at least there's now a greater foundation of people of color. So there are more flies in the buttermilk. The key is how many can get out of it and get to the top of the pail. That's
Well, that's right. Turn it to cream and get out.
that's
Uh,
right. That's right. That's right.
but
That's the key.
no, that's right. And as you talk about wanting people to leave, Secretary Bunch, think about the way in which you tradition, and that is, through the
Right.
museum and handing down and traditioning through mentorship,
Right.
uh, and helping people to hone their own vision, claim their own voice, have the confidence of their gaze, and have the confidence of their questions. And I've experienced in the African American Museum, not simply what's there, what you curated, but it's always been a place. I've been there to see it, and I've been there to be engaged in conversation of the conversations that you're talking about. But let's talk about another part of these conversations, another part of history. And you talked about the difference between nostalgia and really sort of engaging history. And that brings to mind the Confederate symbols,
Yep.
right? And as you know, I work also at the National
Yep.
Cathedral, and
Hmm.
one of our first conversations
Yep.
were around those windows
Yep.
uh, in the cathedral. What, there are museums, and there are public square spaces, and then we have Confederate symbols, be they monuments or stained glass windows. Where do symbols like that belong?
Well, I've always argued that the South lost the war, but they won the peace. Um, and their ability to create through these monuments to create a mythologized Civil War, a mythologized South. What I find fascinating is that these monuments were not created in 1865.
That's right.
Some were created during the beginning of formal segregation, some as late as the 1950s. So they were more about white supremacy than they were about the Civil War. And I believe very strongly as a historian, you don't erase history, but you better prune it like a good rose bush.
Right.
And by pruning history, some of those, I remember talking to Mayor Landrieu of New Orleans
Yeah.
and said, look, whatever you do, take them down, put them in a warehouse where they can be interpreted. I was so moved by a place in Budapest where they took the old Soviet statues and took them down, but put them in a park because they said, this is part of who you are. This has shaped who you've been for the last 50 or 60 years. So you don't want to lose that, but you want to contextualize it.
That's
So
right.
for me, I'm a big believer in taking some down, replacing them with stories of women who are the smallest number of statues in this country are for women.
Yeah.
Replacing those so there's more room for that, but also to contextualize what it means to have Robert E. Lee as a symbol.
Yeah.
So hopefully these will go in museums. Some will get melted down and be made into something better. But the key for me is understanding what they were like. And what always hit me living in this area for many years is I used to always drive to Alexandria, and I would always get caught at the light that had that Confederate monument with his back to Washington, but looking me in the face.
Yeah.
I was offended every time
Yeah. That's
because
right.
I thought, let me tell that story. Let me explain why this matters, and why is it that the losers won the peace. And
Yeah.
so I'm a big believer in these are teaching moments, but the notion that they're sacrosanct, that they shouldn't be touched. I mean, good gracious, the one thing we know is that the who we celebrate evolves over time. So you've got to be able to make different statues and different monuments. So I'm a big believer in prune um, with reckless abandon.
No, and I love this notion, contextualize. I grew up in Ohio, so we didn't have Confederate monuments, but boy, did we have the flags.
Yep.
And actually, they made me fearful. And then when I came this way, I saw the monuments. So I like this notion of contextualizing. That's what museums do,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
we put on the public space and the public square tells a story of not only who we are but who we want to be. uh,
Exactly.
uh, and,
Exactly. Because
and
you put your finger on what is a really key issue, and that is, you know, I always believe that if we're to have a shared future, we need to have a shared past,
uh,
and a past that's ripe with candor and truth. Or as John Hope Franklin used to say to me, the great historian, he said two things always: tell the unvarnished truth, and make sure when people go through a museum, they're changed. And
yeah.
so for me, that's the power of history, that it gives you unvarnished truth, and it can change your lens, your gaze, your understanding And that's why for me that the notion of not being able to teach history, not being able to tell certain stories is not only frightening,
Yes,
um, but it's disappointing in a nation that views itself as a leader of the free world.
that's right.
You
That's right.
can't be a leader of a free world if you're afraid of your own history.
That's right. And it's how have we become a nation that is afraid to grapple with the truth, and a nation that's afraid to rise to the questions that the truth asks. You know, we don't have to have the answers. And what I like about the African American Museum of History and Culture is that you leave with more
That's
questions
right.
than you do answers, and it keeps you coming back to the
That's right.
museum, by
That's
the
right.
way, but
That's
it
right.
also makes you dig down into your history.
What I hope the museum does is inspire new generations of activists
That's right.
to help a country live up to its ideals.
Yeah. You have often said that, and then I'm going to shift it a little bit, but as you say that, you've often said and repeat often in your book that you want to make the ancestors smile. And as I've said to you previously, they are smiling, but you're also making the generations yet to come, they will be smiling as well. And
Thank you.
that's what that museum does. Let me shift just a little bit, and
Sure.
so that I can get this in before got to let you go, because you're doing some important work here in helping us to reckon with our story as a nation. But that is about the story of faith and religion. And
Yep.
here's what I want to ask you. You tell, of course, a story that I laugh about of your first encounter with Mr. Jenkins,
Yep. Princey Jenkins.
first
Hmm.
Preston Jenkins. And one thing that he left you with, besides the affirmation that you didn't like snakes,
That's
uh,
right.
but is he said to you, he said, not you should not remember to tell the story, not simply that we want to remember, but that we need to remember. When I think about this and the times we're in, when in so many ways, as you've also said, the soul of our nation is at war. There's a
Hmm.
battle for the
Hmm.
soul of our nation. And I can't agree with that more. What is the story you have in the African American Museum? Of course, you have to tell the story of Black faith, and that's where I come from and
Sure.
move and work. What is the story from Black faith? Not simply that we want to remember, but that we need to remember, those of us who are religious and faith leaders today, as we grapple in these times with a nation whose soul is in danger
That's right.
of being
That's
lost.
right. I mean, I've always been struck by several things. First of all, what religion has done, especially for the African American community, is created a sense of believing when you shouldn't have believed,
Mhm.
believing in a future. I mean, I'm always amazed at our enslaved ancestors. How
Yeah.
did folks on these plantations that have never gone more than 5 miles from that plantation, how did they imagine freedom? How did they imagine education? So, in some ways, for me, it is what religion has given people has been a foundation to believe beyond what they can see, and envision an America yet to be. And
Yeah.
that, I would argue, is one of the great contributions of Black faith leaders, is to help us imagine an America yet to be.
Yeah.
And because I think the most important thing is to be able to believe that you can make a change, or
Mhm.
believe that a change is going to come.
Yeah.
And
Sam.
that's what religion does. And I would argue that in the museum, people said to me, "Are you going to do an exhibition on religion?" I said, "No, it's everywhere. That in every part of the museum, whether it is, a small group of enslaved people under a brush arbor, trying to find sustenance to get for the next day, or whether it is Martin Luther King and faith leaders standing at the front line for the fight of racial justice, or rather it is people who we don't know their names, but
Mhm.
who courageously, in small congregations, said publicly, you do not accept the way things are,
Yeah.
accept the way things should be." And that to me is one of the great strengths of the faith-based traditions. And as I've always said, it's part of the glue that holds a community and holds a country together.
Yeah, no, I often say just what you just said, that I the thing that I can't wrap my mind around is those enslaved ancestors of ours who never breathed a free breath, never dreamt that they would breathe a free breath, yet fought for freedom anyhow.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
as I always say, the freedom that they knew would be, because it was the freedom that was the justice of God.
Yep.
And they open up our moral imaginary. And I think that the museum does that for us in so many ways. If you start down in the bowels of the ship,
Yes,
right?
Lord. Mm.
And the first time I went through there, I couldn't get out from that space. But, so you did your job,
Yeah.
but thinking of all of those souls lost, but also all of those souls that came across and never ever saw freedom, but they never gave up.
Never. Never.
And so a museum that opens up our moral imaginary
Right.
and
That's
faith
right.
tradition that does that.
But it's also building on all of those faith traditions, which has really also got me through building a museum. I would tell the story in my book of going to Israel,
Yeah.
bringing people on my team to Israel, and we were on this bus and they were giving us tours, and suddenly I noticed we were crossing the River Jordan. I told him, stop that bus. He was like, what? Stop. And we all got out, black, white, and we prayed at the River Jordan and we sang spirituals, and we knew that just like our ancestors, we were dipping into, at least imaginally, into that River Jordan and knowing freedom was
Mhm,
coming. And
mhm.
so to me, it is really the faith base of my work is in everything I do.
Yeah,
It really is shaped by that belief. It's a belief in we can imagine a world yet anew, but also it's a belief that if you struggle long enough, you will get to the promised land.
yeah, yeah. You know what, Secretary Bunch? Can you talk about your mother, 90 some years old,
93.
93 years old, and I shared with you stories of
Mm-hmm.
my great grandmother. Can you and my grandmother had a dream that her four grandkids would finish high school.
Mm.
Can you imagine what they're thinking now as they look at you, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, that in their day, the kind of institute they would not have been able to go into?
No, exactly. I mean,
And
I think I feel in a good way the pressure of history,
yeah,
the burden of history, because I recognize that even though I don't think about it all the time, people come up to me, young black museum professionals, and talk about how important it is that I'm where I am because they now believe they can be there.
right.
And so for me, it is less about me. So, I'm just some guy from Jersey trying to make it in the big city. But it really is about recognizing how do we ensure future generations can build on the work that was done before.
That's right.
How can I make sure, as I tell people, people say, well, what does it take to be secretary? You work hard, but you realize it's not about you, that
Yeah.
it's about the doors you open, it's about the opportunities you create, it's about the lives that you can help change. If you do that, then you've done your job.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to get you out of here on time. So I want to got to ask two
Sure.
last questions. One is this, and you alluded to this in one of your earlier questions. You had to work with a whole lot of different people. You still do. But in building the museum with people who didn't believe that it was necessary for a number of reasons, some good reasons,
Hmm.
some not so good reasons, some that were reflective of race in America. And folks who certainly didn't believe that it belonged on the mall.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
uh, so, and you continue to have to do that. And it was of necessity for you to do that to raise funds and to change people's minds. How? What do we learn from you about leading across differences?
Well, I think the first thing I learned is that being right, being smart isn't enough. That you really got to also be political. So what I would always do is anticipate different points of view, criticism, and think about, all right, how do I handle that? Now there were people who said, my God, this is a story that shouldn't be on the mall. And I said, okay, those are the people that I need to humanize the story. I
Mm,
need to not talk about slavery or migration, but we talk about this family and their struggle for freedom. That enabled people who didn't normally care to suddenly see themselves,
mhm.
and that helped. And the other thing was having a clear sense of where I could compromise and where I wouldn't. I never went into a meeting saying, "Well, we'll see how this plays out." I said it's got to go A, B, or C. I can go with those. If it goes anywhere else, we're not going to make it. And so to really recognize that you got to be strategic, you got to figure out how to humanize it, and then the other thing was, I don't even know how to define this except to say sometimes you just have to be stubborn. You just have to say, you know what? I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not a table pounder, but I am somebody that's going to be real clear that if I think you're disrespecting the culture, you're going to hear about it. So so there were times I had to say, we'll walk away from this
Yeah.
because I'm being disrespected.
Yeah, no, and I so appreciated those stories, and I appreciate this storytelling, humanizing, and sometimes bringing people into a common story, but also appreciating that you don't compromise your core values and
Right,
compromise
right.
your soul. And you certainly, I like the story when you said, I really might have to walk away from this.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I remember
So,
my staff saying, "You can't walk away from money." I said, "I can walk away from disrespect."
yeah, thank you. Say that again. You can walk away from
From
disrespect.
disrespect. Don't be disrespectful to me. That's the one thing I will not tolerate. I will not tolerate anybody disrespectful to black culture, to black people. I will not. I mean, that's where I'll fight all day because I will not accept that. We've been too much. We've been the backbone. We've sacrificed. We've died, but we believed. So I want those people to be worshipped and honored.
This Episcopalian is going to say amen.
Yeah.
so, so last question.
Sure.
You are a man that's dealt with the past and made your vocation how we remember the past. But you've used that memory of the past and that gaze upon the past to help us create a better future. From that vantage point, as the secretary, first Black secretary of the Smithsonian, as the founding director of the African American Museum of History and Culture, as a historian, if you closed your eyes and imagined from those vantage points a just future, a just society, what would it look like?
You know, there'd be two words ringing in people's ear: freer and fairer.
Mm,
And that in essence, what I would love is to build on, words of Martin Luther King or James Baldwin or, Ida B. Wells, who basically says all we're asking for is for a country to live up to its stated ideals
mm,
and to make sure that you recognize that when we're all in the game is elevated. And what I really want more than anything else is to dream a world that will be worthy of the dreams and hopes of my grandchildren.
mm, mm. Nothing more to be said for that except thank you,
Oh, you're the
Secretary
best.
Lonnie Bunch. No, you're the best for helping us get a little closer. And I mean this, the work you have done has brought us just a little bit closer to dreaming the world that will be worthy of all of our grandchildren. Thank you for sacrificing yourself to that dream.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for this conversation because these are the conversations that do allow a world to rethink itself, that
Mm,
do allow us all to find that. I'm a big believer. Let's find the way to the promised land. Let's divine it in the right way.
I agree. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. I invite you back on Friday afternoon at 2:30 with a conversation with Richard Rothstein, who has written a book that we all also must read, The Color of Law, the way in which the government segregated a nation. Thank you for joining us.